All right, so now that our master sequence is set up, we have our master edit here with all of our scenes. Our level of visibility track has been taken care of because we have multiple levels taking place over multiple literal levels. So our environments, our sets, our virtual locations are in different levels that we've actually called into this timeline via the level visibilities track. We have our titles, we have our audio mix in. What do we do next? Well, this is up to you, and this shows the flexibility of filmmaking inside of Unreal Engine. And I'm not just talking about pre-visualization, I'm talking about filmmaking itself. If you want to make an actual short with assets inside of the engine. The first workflow, which is the traditional workflow, is we're going to go over here to render this movie into a video, image, or frame sequence. Since we're doing final frame here, I'm going to export actually as Apple ProRes. I can encode this into H.264 if I want to upload it to a site later on. I can choose my audio output format. I can include my audio submix, or I can choose no audio. I'm going to include my audio since I took the time to actually mix it inside of the engine. I want to stick with my 24 frames per second frame rate, and here's where I can choose the resolution. Now, I'm going to say do 1080 at a minimum because that's what we're all used to, but you can go up to UHD, you can do a custom resolution, and you can also choose your progressive or interlace mode. So if I scroll down here, the only other thing that I really need to do, I don't need to uncheck anything. Even under animation, I don't need to uncheck anything. All I'm really worried about where my output directory is. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up here. I already have it set up to my hard drive to where I'd like to place it. If you need to choose where you'd like to place it, you just click on these dots here. It's going to open up a menu for where you can save your file. And really, once you've decided what your settings are here, press Capture Movie. And you'll see a movie render preview pop up right here. And depending on what type of machine you have, mine actually is a pretty modest machine. I am running a 1080, but it's a little bit older. I have 32 gigs of RAM and I have a much older processor. It's going to take a minute for this to kick off. But once it does, you'll be able to actually preview your entire film being rendered inside of this screen right here before the file is complete. So as we can see here, our frame is up. I actually have a little time code indicator down there within the letterbox crop. But the entire movie is going to render out here. And once again, depending on your specs, it may or may not render out real time. So it's amazing to me, once again, this is all real time. I'm rendering this out real time. Let's say myself, or if I'm doing this for somebody else, creative lead, director, project director comes in and is like, you know what, we need to tweak the atmosphere on that planet. Well, I can just press stop, go into my master edit, go to where that shot is, tweak the atmospheres for the value of the planet, come back, re-export. Barely any time is lost iteratively during this process, which is pretty incredible. And as you can see here, we're really not even in this mode, even in the render mode, encountering any sort of hitches. One thing that I want to make you aware of is even if you notice something here like hitching a little bit like that, we just dropped a frame or two there, that's not happening in your actual render. This is making sure that every single frame is rendered. You might see some hitches up here, but that will not translate to your actual rendered movie. Now, when we talk about interactivity, which is what we're going to look at next, there might be a slight difference there, and that's when scalability is going to come into mind as sort of an option that we have here that we may or may not want to use. But here you have it. Like in the time it's taken me to sort of talk through all of this to you, our short film created inside of the engine is finished, and it's done, and it's pretty much ready to go here with this last shot. So the next thing that I'd like to show you here is, so we've gone over exporting our movie as a traditional film from point A all the way to point B, but now is time for a completely different approach. And this is something that, for me, this is just a lot of fun to sort of put this level of interactivity into the project. For you, it really is going to depend on whether or not you feel like your narrative needs to utilize this, or whether on a functional level you want a tool like this. But instead of rendering out here, I'm just going to go ahead and press play. And you're going to see what sort of comes up. As you can see on the bottom right there, there's a T key where I can use to toggle time code. This could be for notes. This just could be for keeping track, or it's a little fancy little gizmo I've put there at the bottom. But I've also given myself with the ASD keys the ability to fast forward, the ability to rewind, and of course pause. Now you might be asking, okay, well that's pretty simple. Why would we need to do that? Well, the reason I've done this is if I pause at any given moment, I've also unlocked the ability for the user to control the camera. So not the position of the camera, but just the rotation. So what I'm wanting to happen here is I'd like for people to sort of see the artifice behind all of this. So you can sort of see where that texture is broken a little bit, or you can see sort of how the scene is being put together. If I fast forward a little bit more, let's go to a scene like this where we have a shot that's completely framed up and it looks nice in the sense of the way it's framed, but the moment I look at the ground, we start seeing how this breaks and how none of this is meant to be seen except for the exact view that I am presenting through the camera. So that's just one of the many things that you can do with interactivity. Of course, here, if we turn over literally right at the edge of the camera frame, this shot breaks. But it also gives you a little bit of an insight into how I actually put something like this together. Over there, okay, we'd see in the HDRI image, there was a beach with buildings. Clearly not appropriate on this exotic xenoplanet. But, you know, I just thought this was a little bit of fun. It gave the user the ability to, you know, create, in a way, their own camera movement. And this is just me moving the mouse. So it's still tied to the edit, but, you know, at any given moment, if you pause, you can sort of rotate and look around and see what else is happening. And these are all simple blueprints. There's nothing inherently crazy about this if you understand blueprinting. I'll go ahead and I'll sort of open this up and we can sort of take a look. I mean, this is one of my favorites. Like, look over here. I mean, this is just useless. It's almost like if you're on a sound stage and you have the perfect view of what you want to see, you go over to grab your coffee and then all of a sudden, I mean, it's just completely useless. Like none of this would ever make it on film, right? So it just gives you an idea, though, of how I'm also just designing for the frame. I'm not worried. This isn't a game. This isn't an interactive navigable experience. I've curated the camera to such a degree that if I were to turn even 5 degrees, 10, 20 degrees to either end, I would see how this illusion breaks completely. So how did I do this? Let's take a look. So if I go into, this is all inside of the master edit blueprint, but you can copy and paste this and sort of modify this into your own controller or anything else. If I open this up, what we're going to see here is, let me give you a little bit of a zoom out, is all the functionality that I've sort of built in. So let's first go to the setup here. So I've enabled VSync so there's no screen tearing. If you wanted to deploy this as an interactive experience full screen, that'll make sure that there's no sort of jaggies or screen tearing as camera pans left, right, moves up and down. I've done that by getting the game user settings. So you will have to understand a little bit about blueprints and how they work to sort of see how this functions. And then I'm going to disable input for a second. So just in case somebody's mouse moves at the beginning of the movie, nothing's going to happen. Like it's not going to like alter the initial viewpoint. I've created my level sequence player that then starts my film. I've made that into a variable in case I ever want to call that later. So then it plays and I've added our cinematic UI widget. All right, and this is that fast forward, pause, rewind. Whenever you press WASD, you saw those controls on the bottom left. Also included time code, and I've added that to the viewport. Here, I've manually built in how long I want before the title comes in, opposed to doing it as a built-in event in sequencer or an animated event inside of the title itself. I decided I'd rather control that here. Then the title comes up. I delay for about 12 seconds. That was sort of the amount of timing that I chose before I started loading all those other levels into the background, basically every other set into the level streaming background. Now, in terms of the actual controls, one thing that's super important, I'm actually going to comment this out here, is quit. All right, if you do not build in a quit game key, somebody's going to have to Alt F4 or Control Alt Delete to get out of your experience. So we don't want that. So the escape key will essentially exit to desktop. Now, the interactive camera control is interesting. So what I've done here is the reason that I made my level sequence a variable is because I can call items from it or actors from it. In this case, I'm getting the active camera. So what this means is in my level sequence, which is that master edit, at any given moment, it's going to detect which camera is active. And what I'm doing from there, from this return value, is I'm adding relative rotation based off my input axes. So this is very similar to a game controller in a way. But I'm locking off certain things. And for instance, on this, I'm used to inverted controls. So I've added a -1 as my pitch. So when I move the mouse as pitch, a negative value will give me the upwards rotation. So if you look at this, you'll sort of see I have an event tick here, and my event tick is essentially saying, I'm sure there's a more elegant way to do this, but I am not a blueprint master. This is, I think, what is interesting is I'm a filmmaker first and foremost. I've learned these tools to best help execute my vision. There's a million different ways to do things in blueprints. This is just the way that I'm doing it. I'm basically checking to see every tick because I don't have too much other stuff going on, so I'm not worried about overloading anything to see that if I've gone back to frame 0. Which was essentially the 0 frame was the start frame for the sequence. If that's true, I'm basically just going to start this whole thing over. I've put a print string in there. I've unchecked the print to screen option so it doesn't show up. But if I ever want to debug that, I can just check that back on to make sure it's going. The current level name, all right, means I'm getting the current level name, and that's the name that's the name of the level that I'm going to open. Now, if it's false, what's going to happen is we're going to say that the level sequence is playing. And if that's true, we're getting our camera view. All right. And this was a debug that I created to print to string the name and location of the camera. So when I was going through this, if I had these selected and we press play here, you'll see that it's going to tell me which camera actor I'm actually using and what the actual position in the scene of that camera is over here with the debug. So I can go back and rename that to camera 1, 50 millimeters, et cetera, and it will actually display that information. And then what also is going to happen is I've created that time code thing on the bottom right. I'm just getting my seconds. I'm filling out a cinematic UI widget that I've created. I can browse to that over here under cinematics UI. And what I've essentially done here is this text block, if I click on that, is bound. Excuse me. I'm changing this text block right here to be associated with this value right here, which is the in text, which is my current time, qualified frame times to seconds. That's what fills out that part of my text blocks in my cinematics UI widget. You can add all sorts of stuff to this if you want. You could add aperture settings. You could say this is the aperture we're at. This is the angulation of the camera. This is the shutter speed. All sorts of stuff like that you can add just by dropping in text blocks here and binding them to values from your camera that's inside of the level sequence. But if we continue, right, if we've reached the end, I've bounded finished event here to the level sequence. I'm going to get the current name and start over again too. So essentially this is a looping experience here. So what about my playback controls? They're pretty easy here. In terms of toggling the time code, I have a T pressed input going to flip-flop, which will either show or hide my time code. Now, the pause system's a little bit more complicated. If we look at it here, I have it using spacebar or the S key, since ASD A is rewind, S is pause, D is forward. I have these events going to the level sequence, pause or play, right? Because it is a toggle. And essentially what I'm doing is, this is a lot of spaghetti here, but I'm essentially starting and stopping the sequence and displaying text in my widgets. All right, so if you take the time to look through that, you'll sort of see how that works. This is just one of a infinite amount of examples of what you can do with this sort of stuff. If we go back down here too, we have the reverse key, which is A, right? So if I'm paused or I am fast forwarding, if that's true, nothing's going to happen. If it's false, we're going to do this flip-flop here with the play rate going backwards. And you can sort of check that out too. All this stuff you're seeing in the middle here, which I could minimize to macros. I'm just trying to leave everything visible for people to check out here. This all has to do with just target text on the UI and nothing else. All right, so these aren't, functions or anything. These are just visibility of text objects on the screen. And the same thing with fast forward. So the amazing part about this to me is the ability to go in and move the camera around. So I can sort of decode how this all went together. So like if I'm in here and I press pause and I just want to look around, it's like, oh, there are the cryopods from later on in the scene. But nothing else in this environment is lit or even worth looking at, right? It's just sort of hobbled together. In a way, it reminds me a lot of being on an actual set. So if I fast forward just a little bit more, we'll get a little bit more light in here. You can see a little bit more of what's going on. But, a lot of these details are meaningless. I could go back through maybe to save some resources and just, get rid of most of this stuff and just go back to gray boxing it and making sure that the light isn't affected too much. But you'll see that, especially this one, it's like if I move over, I can look around all over the place here. Like none of this is relevant except exactly what we framed up. Same thing once we go inside here. One thing that's kind of interesting is the particles do not pause, but you can sort of see how this is put together. The model has her eyes and mouth open, so that's why I've chosen to frame it sort of out so you can see the nameplate on her armor instead, which becomes the focus. But you can see that this is all just, I can imagine somebody doing this on a tiny part of a soundstage with this little set put together and none of this actually mattering except what was in the frame. And likewise here, if we turn around, that's where the planet is. I might as well just remove that. It's not adding anything to the scene, but it's all part of how I built this scene up. I was feeling distances out, all sorts of stuff like that. And now that with this level of interactivity has become sort of revealed to the viewer or to the user, if you will. Same thing here. Now this is right. But as you can see, even one more example here, if I look up at the top, the halo effect from this planet is not correct back there. There's nothing back there, but it's not in the frame, so I don't care. I'm going for an effect that, would give me this side of the planet. One thing that's interesting about this is that over here off to the side, I press Shift F1 so I can actually see my mouse. I tried doing this as a pure material, and I couldn't get it exactly how I wanted. So what this layer of atmosphere actually is a duplicated sphere with just a glowing material that I've just sort of offset from the surface, which is why over here it doesn't work, right? Because it's, it has to be scaled up, of course, so it's not going to work properly. Same thing for that smaller moon there that's involved in this scene. And of course, the scale distance between this colony ship and the planet is in no means or any way literal. But this is just an example, albeit a slightly mundane example, but this is an example of how you can use the engine to further enhance the project that you're creating with little bits of interactivity. So if I've decided that I would like to have the interactive version, the non-traditional movie file version of my project, I need to package it as a standalone application. So to do that, depending on what platform you're on, you're going to go to File, Package Project, and then choose your deployment. Most of us are going to be deploying to Windows or Mac. If we're deploying to Windows, notice that you do not have an option to build for Mac, and vice versa. If you're on a Mac, you do not have an option to build for Windows. Now, if you're going to do Android or something like that, you're essentially going to have to go through the entire process of downgrading this, converting it to an Android project, making sure that you have all the repos set up, Android Works, all that sort of stuff installed if you want to make an actual app. Now, if you want to make a standalone desktop version, though, you're going to go to Windows 64-bit. You can actually change the configuration, and then you just go to Package, all right? And then it's going to start packaging in the background. It's going to ask you where you'd like to save it. All right, so one thing that you need to do before that, if you go to Edit and go to Project Settings, you can open up a menu here, and essentially this is going to be everything to do with your project under packaging. And this is what you're going to want to go through. Refer to the Unreal Engine documentation. Decide what you need to actually change here or what you need to add. Now, in my general settings for my project, I've actually added my own thumbnail to this, but you can go as far as to add thumbnails and icons for what your actual project application icon will look like if you'd like to deploy it that way. Now, the last thing that I'd like to mention before you get ready to package this. So if you're doing this straight to a video file, you don't have to worry about this other than if you're just worried about like saving space on your hard drive. But if you're going to package this as an application, you're going to want to make sure by two methods, either going through your content browser and removing manually all the assets, anything that you're not using that's going to bulk up the size of this project, you're going to want to get rid of. The other thing that you can do, which is why, once again, I love using this whole idea of a master edit map, is I can go to this master edit map right here. I can right click, I can go to asset actions, and I can migrate it into an empty project. So a project that has nothing else in it. So if I do this and I click on migrate, what this is going to do is it's going to give me an asset report. And this asset report, this very, 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 very long list, is indicative of every single thing that is used in this master edit, and then by default, the master sequence itself. Now, this might sound crazy, but if you're using a lot of Quixel assets, you're using a lot of assets from the marketplace that are 20 gigs, 10 gigs, 15 gigs, even more, your project, this entire project itself, I believe when I started it out, was over 150 gigs. Now, like, that's just not manageable for a 3-minute short film to expect people to download that much. So after doing this entire process, getting rid of everything that I did not need, that was not used at any point throughout the frame of this film, I have managed to bring that down less than 10 gigs, which is pretty crazy. All right, that becomes a little bit more manageable. It's still a lot, but it's a little bit more manageable. Now, for your own archiving purposes, I would suggest not migrating any of this stuff into a smaller project, because if you ever want to go back to this and make some tweaks, you should still have your main project version here with everything inside of the content folders in case you want to, tweak some stuff, replace a model, change the HDRI in the background into one that you already have here in your HDR folder, anything like that. Definitely make sure that you archive your project separately from the version of the project you're going to archive as your shipping build or your packaged final film.